It was the freezing dawn of December 14th, 1944, somewhere on the outskirts of a shattered German village near Aachen, when a column of exhausted German civilians stumbled helplessly through the ruins. For days, artillery shells had torn through their homes, forcing mothers to clutch their infants tighter than blankets, praying that each blast would not be their last. Smoke, hunger, and fear had become their daily companions. Among them were nearly 24 German mothers, frightened, starving, and too exhausted to form complete sentences, but still forcing themselves forward because their babies depended on them. Rumors spread that American forces were closing in, and the mothers had no idea what to expect. Would they be captured, turned away, punished? No one knew. All they wanted was shelter from the relentless winter and the screaming guns behind them. But in their minds, American soldiers were the enemy, and the enemy was not supposed to show mercy. When the first group of American soldiers appeared through the mist, helmets low, rifles, slung coats, heavy with frost, panic rippled through the mothers. Some clutched their babies tighter, others tried to shield them with trembling hands, and a few simply froze in place, unable to breathe. They had grown up hearing stories that the Americans were ruthless, that they would tear families apart, that they would treat German civilians with cruelty and humiliation. One mother, Elise, whispered under her breath, "Bit, not my baby, not him," as her infant cried from cold and hunger. The American squad leader, Sergeant Thompson, raised his hand, not to threaten, but to signal his men to soften their stance. The mothers didn't understand, their minds prepared for the worst. But the Americans simply stood there, letting the silence settle, letting the fear drain slowly from the air. The women expected commands, interrogations, or the ripping away of their children. Instead, the soldiers did something no one imagined. Sergeant Thompson stepped forward slowly, lowering his rifle until it rested harmlessly on his back. His eyes scanned the infants, shivering in their mothers' arms. Tiny hands, blue from cold, small faces stained with soot. He understood instantly. These mothers were not a threat. They were barely surviving. Without saying a word, Thompson removed his gloves and sighed deeply. The other soldiers watched, unsure, until he gently extended his arms toward the nearest woman. She flinched and instinctively stepped back, convinced he meant to take her child away forever. But Thompson shook his head and tapped his chest, then pointed to the baby. He wasn't taking the child prisoner. He wanted to carry the baby somewhere warm. The village schoolhouse behind them had been converted into a temporary aid station with blankets and hot milk. Slowly, very slowly, one mother loosened her grip. Thompson lifted the crying infant in his arms, with a tenderness no one expected from a soldier in wartime. And then it happened. The first spark of disbelief spread across the mothers' faces. Once the first mother relented, the others hesitated, but didn't flee. Two more soldiers stepped forward, removing their helmets and offering their arms. The women began crying quietly, overwhelmed by exhaustion and shock. These weren't violent captors. These were young men, some barely older than the women themselves, doing their best to show humanity in a world torn apart. As the soldiers gently took the babies, they shielded them from the cold with their own coats. One soldier, Private Henderson, held twin babies against his chest, whispering softly, in English, "You're okay now. You're safe." The mothers, stunned and trembling, watched as their infants stopped crying and slowly warmed in the soldiers' arms. For the first time in months, the women felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not despair, but a fragile sense of relief. The Americans led the mothers toward the makeshift aid station. Inside, they placed the infants near small stoves, wrapped them in freshly issued army blankets, and prepared warm milk from their own rations. The German mothers, still in disbelief, stood silently against the wall until Thompson gestured for them to come closer. One by one, the soldiers handed the babies back, warm, calmer, and safe, and the women collapsed into tears. Elise, who had been unable to speak earlier, whispered shakily, "Why are you helping us?" Thompson didn't hesitate. He simply said, "Because they're children, and your mothers. That sentence broke the final barrier. The women, who had been taught their entire lives to view Americans as savage enemies, now saw them not as soldiers, but as human beings, strangers, who protected their most precious lives without expecting anything in return. For hours, the soldiers continued assisting melting snow for water, sharing food, and even taking turns carrying infants so mothers could rest. Some American men wiped their eyes discreetly, shaken by the realization that war had brought them faced not with an enemy force, but with innocent families caught in the crossfire. When the time came for the unit to move again, the Germans gathered their children and looked at the Americans with expressions no words could describe. Some mothers bowed their heads. One reached forward and held Thompson's hand briefly, tears falling onto his glove. As the soldiers marched away, the babies wrapped in oversized American blankets. The women whispered prayers, not for victory, not for revenge, but for the safety of the men who had shown them compassion. In a war defined by destruction, this brief, fragile moment became one of the rare scenes where humanity triumphed over hatred, and where German mothers wept, not from fear, but from grief. By the time the sun began sinking behind the skeletal remains of the Black Forest villages, the German mothers, who had survived the chaos of the eastern evacuations, were barely recognizable as the women they once were. Their dresses were torn from weeks on the move, their hands cracked from cold, their faces gaunt from rationalist nights. Most carried infants wrapped in whatever scraps they could find, shawls, curtains, even pieces of their own coats. The roads behind them were littered with carts, abandoned belongings, and memories they no longer wished to remember. To them, every approaching bootstep meant danger. Every unknown uniform meant possible separation from their children. So when the rumble of American military trucks reached their ears, dread washed over them like winter rain. They huddled closer together, whispering prayers, preparing to be treated as enemies, not as mothers simply trying to keep their children alive. The American convoy stopped near a collapsed barn. Its roof caved in, its walls burned black. Soldiers climbed out cautiously, scanning the area for threats. But instead of armed men, they found a group of trembling women, clutching babies so tightly their knuckles whitened. The mothers didn't speak. They didn't move. They only stared, breath held, waiting for the moment the soldiers would bark orders or drag them apart. For these women, surrender had always been described by German propaganda as humiliation. Infants seized, women mistreated, families torn apart. They expected shouting harsh commands, maybe even weapons raised at them. But nothing happened. The lead American soldier simply lowered his rifle, removed his gloves, and knelt down in the cold mud. He spoke softly, slowly, a gesture that confused the German women even more. Through the interpreter, he said, "We won't hurt you. You're safe now." It sounded impossible. Safety had not existed in their world for months. One baby started crying, a sharp, desperate wail that pierced the tense silence. His mother tried to rock him, but her arms were too weak, her hands too numb. She sank to her knees, her child slipping dangerously from her grasp. Without hesitation, an American soldier stepped forward, but instead of shouting or grabbing, he crouched carefully and lifted the baby with both hands, as if handling something sacred. The mother gasped, covering her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Others cried out, expecting the worst. But the soldier only adjusted his jacket, pressing the child against his chest to give him warmth. The baby instantly calmed, curling into the soldier's coat like it was the first warmth he'd felt in days. The mother collapsed fully now, not in fear, but in disbelief. She wept into her hands, while another soldier gently helped her stand. Soon, more soldiers joined, realizing the infants were freezing. They removed their own wool blankets, cutting them into smaller pieces so each baby could have a warm wrap. Canteens of warm water were passed around. One soldier even poured some into a small metal cup and blew on it to cool it down, before offering it to a toddler whose lips were turning blue. The mothers watched, stunned into silence. Nothing in their understanding of the enemy matched what they were seeing. Men who handled their children with tenderness, men who spoke gently instead of shouting, men who stood back to give the women space instead of crowding them. Word spread quickly. American medical units were nearby. Within an hour, stretchers, heated lamps, and field nurses arrived. A Red Cross nurse knelt beside a young mother who had fainted from exhaustion. While checking her pulse, the nurse's eyes fell on the thin infant beside her. She picked the baby up, wrapped him tight, and whispered, "You're safe now, little one." The mother woke moments later to find her child bundled like a newborn again. She stared at the nurse, as if witnessing a miracle. The soldiers formed a perimeter, but it wasn't to imprison the women. It was to protect them. Fires were lit. Hot broth was cooked. Some mothers were so dehydrated they could barely sip the warm liquid placed in their trembling hands. Soldiers encouraged them, holding the cup steady so they wouldn't spill. As night deepened, the Americans carried the infants, first cradling them carefully, as if they were their own to ward the trucks where warm bedding awaited. One soldier held a pair of twins, one on each shoulder, while their mother followed behind him, crying softly, overcome by the sight. Inside the temporary camp, everything was orderly and calm. The women were guided to heated tents, each equipped with blankets and cots. The babies were checked first, American medics prioritizing the youngest because malnutrition had left many dangerously weak. Some children received their first full meal in weeks inside those tents. Others were given warm milk from field supplies. A few infants were so malnourished that the nurses fed them drop by drop, with careful patience. Another woman, old, frail, with deep lines carved into her face from months of therapy, the interpreter, and asked, in a shaking voice, Why do they help us?" The interpreter paused, then answered simply, "Because your mothers, and because the children, didn't choose this war." The woman covered her face and wept openly for the first time since the conflict began. By midnight, the camp was quiet, except for the soft crackle of fires and the steady breathing of babies. Finally, warm enough to sleep, the soldiers, exhausted from their own duties, sat outside the tents, keeping watch, ensuring nothing disturbed the fragile peace that had settled. And inside, the German mothers, hours earlier, believed their children would be taken from them, slept with tears drying on their cheeks, holding their babies close, realizing that the enemy they feared the most had shown them the greatest mercy they had ever known.